On February 23, 1779, roughly 170 American and French militiamen stood in freezing water outside Vincennes, staring across a flooded plain at the British fort they had come to capture. Some had gone days with almost nothing to eat. Their clothes had been soaked, frozen, thawed, and soaked again. Behind them lay more than 2 weeks of flooded prairie, swollen rivers, improvised boats, and marches through water deep enough to reach a man's chest. Ahead of them stood Fort Sackville, armed, reinforced, and commanded by British Lieutenant Governor Henry Hamilton. By every normal calculation, Clark's force should have been finished before it fired a shot. Instead, less than 2 days later, Hamilton surrendered. No relief army had arrived. Clark had not suddenly received heavy artillery. His exhausted 170 men had not somehow become 1,000. What changed was what the British thought they were facing. And that is the real story of this campaign. Not simply how George Rogers Clark survived an impossible winter march, but how he turned the very conditions that should have destroyed his army into the reason the British never saw him coming, and then used confusion, terrain, rifle fire, and deception to make a small frontier force look far more dangerous than it really was. Because the march to Vincennes was not separate from the battle. The march was the first weapon. 2 months earlier, Fort Sackville had belonged to the Americans. Clark had taken control of the Illinois country during the summer of 1778, capturing Kaskaskia and bringing several French-speaking settlements into the American camp with remarkably little fighting. Vincennes had followed. For a short time, the British position west of the Appalachians seemed to be collapsing. Then, Henry Hamilton moved. Hamilton was not an incompetent officer stumbling into a trap. From his headquarters at Detroit, he understood exactly why the Illinois country mattered. British influence in the West depended on forts, trade routes, native alliances, river networks, and the ability to threaten American settlements in Kentucky and along the Ohio. If Clark remained in control of places like Kaskaskia and Vincennes, that system was in danger. So Hamilton assembled a substantial force of British regulars, French-Canadian militia, and native allies, and marched south. On December 17, 1778, he retook Fort Sackville. The tiny American presence there could not stop him. Captain Leonard Helm surrendered, and Vincennes returned to British control. Hamilton now had the initiative. But winter changed the military equation. The Wabash and Embarrass rivers rose. Water spread across the low country around Vincennes. Roads were primitive even in good weather. Now, whole stretches of the landscape disappeared beneath floodwater. Movement became slow, miserable, and in places nearly impossible. Hamilton intended to resume offensive operations when the season improved. Many of the troops and native warriors who had accompanied him were allowed to disperse for the winter. Fort Sackville remained in British hands. Its defenses were strengthened, and Hamilton could reasonably expect that no serious enemy force would cross the flooded country before spring. That assumption was not foolish. It was almost certainly what most commanders would have assumed, and that was precisely why Clark could use it. At Kaskaskia, Clark's position was deteriorating. He did not possess an army capable of meeting Hamilton at full strength in a conventional campaign. Reinforcements were uncertain, supplies were limited. If he waited until the roads dried and Hamilton rebuilt his larger force, the British would be choosing when and where the next campaign began. Then, Francis Vigo arrived with intelligence from Vincennes. Vigo was a merchant whose movements through the region made him valuable for something more important than trade: information. He had seen the situation around Hamilton's post and returned with the news Clark needed. The British were in Vincennes. Their full winter expeditionary force was no longer concentrated there. Hamilton expected to move against Clark later, and most importantly, he did not expect Clark to move first. That created a narrow window. Clark's problem was that exploiting it required doing something the season itself seemed to forbid. If he waited, the British advantage increased. If he marched now, the landscape might destroy his men before Hamilton ever had to. Clark chose now. The decision made sense only if speed and surprise were worth more than comfort, logistics, and certainty. He was betting that a smaller force arriving unexpectedly could accomplish what a larger force arriving predictably could not. But surprise would disappear the moment word reached Vincennes. That meant the force had to move quickly through a region where quick movement was becoming almost impossible. Clark also created a second element to the operation. A small armed vessel called the Willing would move by water with men and cannon, traveling down the Mississippi, then toward the Ohio and Wabash, with the intention of supporting the attack near Vincennes. It was a useful idea on paper. Clark would advance overland while the boat brought additional firepower by river. In reality, the two groups would be separated across hundreds of miles of difficult country with no reliable communications and no guarantee they would arrive together. There was no radio. No timetable could survive a flooded river. If one half of the operation was delayed, the other might simply have to fight without it. On February 5th, Clark's main column left Kaskaskia. About 170 men marched with him, including American frontiersmen and French volunteers from the Illinois settlements. The first stage did not look heroic. It looked wet. Rain had saturated the prairie. Water spread across the low ground in shallow sheets. At first, the men could simply keep moving through it. Boots filled. Clothing became heavy. Fires were harder to maintain. Sleeping dry became less likely every night. Then, the water deepened. This is where the geography of the campaign becomes more important than any single battlefield maneuver. Southern Illinois and the Wabash country were crossed by rivers, forks, channels, marshes, and low floodplains. In February 1779, those waterways were not neat blue lines on a map. They expanded into one another. A crossing that might have taken minutes in summer could become a broad moving barrier several feet deep. On February 10th, the men reached Petty Fork and found the water too high for an ordinary crossing. So they cut trees. Instead of stopping the campaign, they turned timber into a temporary path and forced the column across. 3 days later came the Little Wabash. This was worse. Floodwater from the Little Wabash and nearby channels had spread across miles of country. What should have been a river crossing had become a water-covered zone with no obvious boundary between river, bank, and prairie. Clark could not simply order 170 men forward and hope. They had equipment to move. Weapons had to remain dry enough to function. Powder was useless if soaked. Some men could swim, others could not. Horses had to be managed, so the column stopped and built boats. That detail matters because the campaign was not one continuous charge through dramatic waist-deep water. It was a sequence of engineering problems solved with almost nothing. Cut wood, build a canoe, move baggage first, carry men who could not manage the water. Swim the horses, find the next patch of ground, repeat. Every delay created a new danger. Food was disappearing. Hunting in flooded country was unreliable. Men who spent hours in cold water still had to sleep in wet clothing. And the Willing, the boat carrying the artillery Clark wanted for the final attack, was nowhere in sight. But every mile also produced one advantage Clark could not manufacture any other way. No warning was reaching Hamilton. The same flood that slowed Clark was protecting his secrecy. A normal road creates witnesses. Travelers see troops. Riders carry messages. Settlements hear rumors. An army moving through ordinary country leaves information behind it. Clark was moving through terrain almost nobody expected an army to use at all. Hamilton's winter security rested partly on distance. Clark was turning distance into concealment. By the middle of February, however, concealment no longer mattered if the force could not physically continue. The country became progressively worse. On February 17th and 18th, Clark's men moved through the tangled ground between the Embarrass and Wabash rivers, searching for usable crossings while the target sat frustratingly close. Then they heard something. A cannon. The sound came from Vincennes. The British fort was near enough to announce its presence across the flooded country. That should have been encouraging. Instead, it exposed the cruelty of the situation. The Americans could hear the objective, but they still could not reach it. Between Clark and the fort lay miles of water. The men were running out of food. The armed boat had still not joined them, and Hamilton was strengthening Fort Sackville while Clark's force struggled through the floodplain. The British commander had practical reasons to feel secure. His fort controlled the immediate military position at Vincennes. His men had artillery. Work continued on the defenses. The surrounding water limited the approaches an enemy could use. Winter was doing part of Hamilton's defensive work for him. but a natural barrier has one weakness that a wall does not. A commander may stop watching it. By February 19th, Clark's situation was close to breaking. Food had become the immediate crisis. A hungry army can still fight. An army that has been hungry too long stops being an army. Men lose strength first, then speed, then discipline, then the ability to make choices that require one more mile. The force followed the waterways looking for a passage. They improvised crossings. They waited on patches of higher ground. They searched for anything edible. The fort was still there. The water was still between them. Going backward would mean crossing the same country again with less food than they had started with. Going forward meant entering deeper water. At that point, the mission was no longer just an attack on Hamilton. It had become a contest over whether Clark could keep 170 men moving in the same direction. On February 20th, the Americans captured a small boat and several men from the Vincennes area. The information they obtained was more valuable than the boat. The British still did not know Clark was approaching, and the French population of Vincennes remained sympathetic enough to the Americans that Hamilton could not assume the town itself would act as an early warning system. After more than 2 weeks, Clark still possessed surprise. That was extraordinary. But surprise had an expiration date. One hunter could see the column. One canoe could escape. One man could reach the fort. Then Hamilton would close the gates, prepare his artillery, call every loyal man available, and turn Clark's exhausted force into attackers facing a prepared position. Clark had spent nearly the entire campaign buying one advantage. He now had to cash it in before the men collapsed. On February 21st and 22nd, the march entered its worst stage. The Americans crossed the Wabash with boats and improvised craft, leaving behind what they could no longer move. Beyond the river lay the flooded plain south of Vincennes. There was no dramatic mountain to climb, no fortified bridge, no enemy line, just water. Flat, cold, seemingly endless water. At points it rose from the waist toward the chest. Shorter men had a harder time keeping their footing. The bottom was uneven. Every step had to be tested before full weight came down. A hole could turn a march into a drowning. Muskets had to be kept above the surface. Powder had to stay dry. Men already weakened by hunger were now pushing against water for hours. This is the moment where leadership stops being a word on an officer's commission. Clark could not make the flood shallower. He could not produce a meal. He could not promise that the fort would surrender when they arrived. The only thing he could control was what the men saw their commander do. Accounts of the march describe Clark blackening his face with gunpowder and entering the water first. No invented speech is needed. The action explains itself. He was asking exhausted men to enter water that looked impassable, so he entered it before them. The column followed. That does not mean nobody hesitated. It does not mean morale suddenly became perfect. It means enough men kept moving, and that was all the operation required. Hours passed. The men pushed through the submerged plain toward small rises of ground where they could pause. Some required help. Sick and weakened men were moved using the limited boats. The entire force was being compressed into a single brutal calculation: preserve enough strength to reach dry ground while keeping weapons usable. At night, cold became another enemy. Wet clothing in February did not simply make the men uncomfortable. It stripped heat from bodies already running on almost no food. Then, on February 23rd, after 18 days of movement, the impossible part of the campaign ended. Clark reached the outskirts of Vincennes with approximately the same force he had led into the flooded country. Now came the dangerous part. Fort Sackville had not disappeared. Hamilton had not surrendered because Americans had suffered enough to deserve it. Clark had brought his men to the battlefield. He still had to solve the battlefield. And here, the situation looked very different from the legend of 170 men simply overwhelming a British fort. Clark did not have the numbers for a conventional assault. He did not have the artillery he had expected from the Willing. His men were exhausted. Hamilton's position included British regulars, armed defenders, cannon, walls, blockhouses, and a commander who had no reason to panic at the sight of a handful of militia. If Clark revealed exactly what he had, he would be giving Hamilton the most useful piece of information on the battlefield. So he did the opposite. He hid weakness by exaggerating strength. Before entering Vincennes, Clark contacted the town and warned inhabitants to remain inside and avoid the fighting. The local population did not rush to Fort Sackville to alert Hamilton. That silence was crucial. For a few more hours, the British commander remained inside his fort without a clear picture of what had crossed the flooded plain. Then, American troops began appearing near the town. Clark used the flags available to his companies and moved men in ways that made the approaching force difficult to count. Groups could be seen, disappear behind rises or buildings, then appear again. To an observer without accurate intelligence, repeated movement could suggest fresh units arriving behind the first. 170 men did not need to become 500. They needed Hamilton to wonder whether they might be. That difference is the center of the operation. Military deception does not require the enemy to believe one precise lie. It only requires him to lose confidence in the truth. By evening, Clark's men entered Vincennes and spread through the town around Fort Sackville. Now, another British problem became visible. Fort Sackville was a defensive position, but its surroundings did not provide an open killing ground. Buildings, fences, and other structures near the fort gave American riflemen cover. That mattered because Clark's men did not need to storm the walls immediately. They could surround the position and make the fort progressively harder to operate. The fighting began on February 23rd. American riflemen opened fire from protected positions around the works. Fort Sackville had cannon. Normally, that should have been the decisive advantage. A cannon firing grape shot into exposed militia at close range could tear an assault apart. But cannon require openings. Gun ports have to be used. Crews have to expose themselves long enough to load, aim, and fire. Clark's marksmen concentrated on those openings. When British soldiers tried to serve the guns, rifle fire made the ports dangerous. The Americans were not destroying the fort with artillery. They were attacking the fort's ability to use its artillery. That distinction is critical. Clark could not match Hamilton's weapons, so he targeted the conditions required for those weapons to function. The battle settled into something closer to strangulation than assault. Shots came from houses and fences. British troops returned fire from the fort. The defenders tried to use their artillery when possible. The Americans kept pressure on the gun ports and exposed positions. Darkness did not end the engagement. The shooting continued. Hamilton now faced a completely different military problem from the one he had expected to face that winter. His original assumption had been simple. The flooded country prevented Clark from attacking before spring. That assumption had failed. His next question was harder. How many Americans were actually outside? He had no reliable answer. How much support did they have inside Vincennes? Again, the answer was uncomfortable. The town's French population was not behaving like a population eager to defend British rule. Some of the French-speaking men connected to Hamilton's force were reluctant to fight people they knew in the settlement, and the Americans outside were not acting like a force about to collapse from hunger. They were acting aggressively. That was deliberate. Clark could not allow Hamilton time to discover how weak the attackers really were. Every hour before British reinforcements became possible favored Hamilton. Every hour before the Americans' exhaustion became obvious favored Hamilton. Every pause gave scouts a chance to learn Clark's real strength. So Clark created pressure faster than Hamilton could create certainty. During the fighting, the Americans began digging toward the fort. Fort Sackville had structural weaknesses. The position near the river and the arrangement of its defenses created areas where an attacker could approach under cover and threaten the works from below. A mine or successful approach against a vulnerable section could turn a contained siege into a breach. Whether the Americans could actually have completed that work before exhaustion and ammunition became serious problems was not the only question Hamilton had to consider. He had to ask whether he could afford to find out. That is what makes psychological pressure effective in war. The enemy does not have to know what you can do. He has to make decisions based on what you might be able to do. By February 24th, Hamilton was looking at several problems at once. Accurate rifle fire was restricting the fort's artillery. The attackers occupied protected positions in the town. Their true strength remained uncertain. A portion of the local population favored them. Some defenders were unreliable. An approach toward the works was developing. And no relief column was suddenly going to appear across the flooded country. Hamilton requested negotiations. Clark did not respond like the commander of a starving force desperate for a way out. He responded like the commander who believed time belonged to him. That was part of the pressure. If Clark eagerly accepted a long truce, Hamilton might conclude that the Americans needed rest. If Clark exposed his supply situation, the British might simply wait. Instead, he demanded surrender. Hamilton sought better terms. The firing resumed. Then, another violent episode increased the tension. A small group of native warriors associated with Hamilton's operations was captured while returning toward Vincennes. Several were executed by Clark's men in view of the fort. The episode reflected the brutal character of the frontier war, where raids, killings of settlers, reprisals, and violence against native communities had created a cycle with few restraints. It also sent an unmistakable signal into Fort Sackville. Clark was not behaving like a commander preparing to retreat. By this stage, the siege had become a contest between what Clark actually possessed and what Hamilton could safely assume. In reality, Clark possessed around 170 exhausted men. He had marched without the artillery support he expected. His logistics were terrible. He was operating deep in flooded country with no conventional supply line. A prolonged siege would be dangerous, but Hamilton did not have the privilege of seeing Clark's situation from above. He saw rifle balls striking near his gun ports. He saw American positions throughout the town. He saw local support slipping away. He saw men digging toward his fort. He knew the enemy had crossed terrain he had considered almost impassable, and he did not know how many more might be behind them. This is where the impossible march finally paid for itself. If Clark had appeared outside Vincennes in June, Hamilton could have asked the obvious questions. Where did he come from? How large is his column? Where are his supplies? How many reinforcements are on the road? Scouts could travel, patrols could move. Messages could escape. The countryside itself would produce information. But in February, the flood that had nearly killed Clark was now isolating Hamilton too. The British commander was trapped inside the same geography that had protected him. Clark had crossed it. Hamilton's reinforcements had not. The obstacle had changed sides. On the morning of February 25th, Henry Hamilton agreed to surrender Fort Sackville. The garrison marched out and laid down its arms. From the beginning of the attack to the capitulation, roughly 38 hours had passed. Not 48, 38. A British fort had fallen to a force that less than 2 days earlier arrived soaked, hungry, and without the artillery vessel that was supposed to support it. And Clark had achieved it without paying the price a direct storming attack might have demanded. The title of this story says, 170 men took a British fort in 48 hours. But the more important question is why? They did not win because 170 militia suddenly became stronger than fortifications and cannon. They won because the campaign was constructed around a chain of advantages that only worked in that exact order. First came intelligence. Francis Vigo gave Clark enough information to understand that Hamilton was temporarily weaker than he would be in spring. That intelligence had value only for a limited time. So Clark converted information into speed. Then came the British assumption. Hamilton treated the flooded winter landscape as a barrier severe enough to delay serious American operations. Clark treated the same landscape as the route to surprise. That did not make the water less dangerous. It meant the danger had strategic value. Then came leadership and logistics. Clark's men did not cross 150-plus miles of difficult country because enthusiasm magically defeated cold. They improvised transportation, built boats, felled timber, protected powder, moved sick men, searched for food, abandoned what they could not carry, and kept solving the next physical problem before worrying about the one after it. Then came the final deception. Once outside Vincennes, Clark understood that his true numbers were not something Hamilton needed to know. Flags, movement, noise, aggression, and the support of the town created uncertainty about the size and confidence of the attacking force. Then came tactical pressure. Riflemen used buildings and fences to reduce their exposure. They targeted the fort's gun ports and made artillery harder to operate. Digging threatened another method of attack. Clark never gave Hamilton a comfortable pause long enough to replace uncertainty with accurate information. and that sequence mattered more than any individual act of bravery. Intelligence created the opportunity. Terrain concealed the approach. Leadership carried the force through the terrain. Deception distorted the British estimate of the force. Rifle fire neutralized part of the fort's firepower. Pressure prevented Hamilton from discovering how fragile Clark's position really was. The British commander surrendered not because he was foolish, but because Clark had engineered a situation in which the information available inside Fort Sackville made continued resistance look increasingly dangerous. There is one final detail that exposes just how narrow the margin was. The Willing, the armed boat carrying the additional men and cannon Clark had hoped to use in the attack, did not arrive until February 27th, 2 days after Hamilton surrendered. The artillery Clark planned around reached Vincennes after the fort had already fallen. That means the campaign succeeded with a major part of its original design missing. Clark did not stop and wait for the plan to become whole again. He changed the method. He had wanted cannon. When he did not get them, he used riflemen to restrict British cannon instead. He had wanted coordinated arrival. When coordination failed, he attacked before surprise disappeared. He did not possess enough men to dominate Hamilton physically, so he dominated the information available to Hamilton. That is the mechanism behind the victory. And it is also why reducing this campaign to an inspirational march through icy water misses the most interesting part. Plenty of armies have endured terrible marches and then lost. Suffering does not create victory by itself. Clark's march mattered because every hardship preserved something Hamilton did not know. The flooded prairie concealed the column. The winter dispersed British strength. The speed denied Hamilton warning. The townspeople denied him intelligence. The flags obscured American numbers. The riflemen denied him comfortable use of his guns. The trenches introduced another threat. By the time Hamilton finally had to make a decision, almost every piece of information reaching him pointed in the same direction. The American position seemed stronger than it was, while his own position seemed to be getting weaker by the hour. That was the illusion. But it was an illusion built on real tactical pressure. Fort Sackville was renamed Fort Patrick Henry after the capture, and Clark moved immediately to secure the victory rather than treating the surrender as the end of the campaign. Men were sent to intercept British supplies and communications before Hamilton's wider network could recover. The British never restored their previous control over Vincennes. The Western War itself did not end. Fighting, raids, diplomacy, native resistance, and competing territorial claims continued long after February 1779. Clark would never capture Detroit, the major British center he ultimately wanted. And it would be an exaggeration to claim that one march alone determined every boundary written into the peace settlement of 1783. But Vincennes mattered. It destroyed Hamilton's immediate attempt to reverse the American gains in the Illinois country. It kept an American military presence alive west of the Appalachians. It denied Britain a key position from which to rebuild pressure on the frontier. And, perhaps most importantly, it demonstrated something that would appear again and again in successful American operations during the Revolution. A weaker force did not always need to defeat the British system where that system was strongest. Sometimes it could attack the assumption holding the system together. At Trenton, weather and surprise helped turn a collapsing army into an attacker. At Saratoga, geography and logistics strangled a British advance. At Cowpens, Daniel Morgan would manipulate expectations about militia behavior. At Yorktown, Allied armies and fleets would close every practical escape route around Cornwallis. At Vincennes, the key assumption was winter. Hamilton believed the season had purchased time. Clark used that same season to steal time away from him. That is why the final image of this campaign should not simply be men standing triumphantly outside a captured fort. Go back 2 days, before the surrender, before the firing, before the flags appeared around Vincennes. Picture the column at the edge of the flooded plain. No cannon behind them. Almost no food. No guarantee that the town would support them. No guarantee the powder would stay dry. No guarantee that after 18 days of suffering, Fort Sackville would not simply close its gates and force them into a siege they could not sustain. The logical choice was to stop. The military advantage existed only because stopping was the logical choice. Clark stepped into the water. The men followed. And once they reached the other side, he never allowed Henry Hamilton enough time to understand how close the impossible march had come to failing. 38 hours later, the British flag came down. Not because 170 men were stronger than an empire, because for one brief winter window, they understood the battlefield better. If you want more American Revolution stories built around the tactics and decisions that actually changed the outcome, subscribe to the channel. And tell us in the comments, what was the decisive weapon at Vincennes? The intelligence that exposed Hamilton's weakness, Clark's decision to cross the flooded country, or the deception that made 170 exhausted men look like an army the British could not safely resist?